Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is August 5th, 2024, and I'm delighted to be here with Harrison Mann. Harrison Mann is a former U.S. Army major and executive officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Middle East Africa Regional Center, who resigned in protest of his office's support for Israel during its Gaza campaign. He previously served as a Middle East all-source intelligence analyst and led a crisis cell coordinating intelligence support for Ukraine. Prior to entering the Defense Intelligence Agency, he worked at the U.S. Embassy, Tunis Office of Security Cooperation, and led Army Civil Affairs teams combating regional smuggling under U.S. Naval Forces Central Command in Bahrain. Harrison, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to just start by asking you about what it was about the Biden administration's policy on Israel and Palestine and the war in Gaza in particular that ultimately you found so objectionable that you decided to resign.
Yeah, and I will preface that by saying I started my resignation in November, which was quite a long time ago. But I'm emphasizing that because everything that we're seeing now, both in Gaza and in the region, was largely predictable back then. And I'm not a special genius. Anybody I worked with, and I think a lot of outside observers too, could see the writing on the wall. By November, I think we were about a week or two into the Israeli ground campaign, but it was, immediately after October 7th, it was clear they were going to be doing deliberate mass bombardment with a attempt to do some sort of mass punishment on civilians in Gaza. And I could also see very early on, both in the president's public statements and then how it looked inside the bureaucracy and the intel community, that even though we were very well informed on the extent of the civilian casualties and infrastructure destruction, that was not going to weigh into the level of support that we were providing. I think that was, stated publicly on the national level, but even in my own agency and in DoD, the conversations about, which were, I think, more from a CYA perspective, like, how do we make sure we're not implicated in possible war crimes or killing of civilians, didn't really go far either. So, even I think in the first month after October 7th, it was really clear that at no level was there going to be any challenge to the unconditional support that we were giving Israel. And I could also see, inside the intel community, that we were never really going to dig into allegations of war crimes or deliberate targeting of civilians, and kind of we were largely going to decide that's not really our purview to look into. And so, with that, and with seeing the behavior of some of our really senior leaders, who are normally people who you kind of get scared when they walk into the room or they come on the call, and they're acting almost dejected or certainly resigned, that, well, we're along for the ride with the Israelis. I don't know what they're going to do tomorrow, but we got to support them no matter what. And so seeing all that at the same time, that I could see everything that I think, you or anybody else who followed the conflict saw, which is the incredible, the indescribable videos and images that were coming out of Gaza. I felt very hopeless, and I felt pretty convinced that it wasn't going to get better. It wasn't going to get better soon. And every day that I kept going to work, I was going to be contributing.
And was there anything in your background that, on this issue, or things that had informed your perspective either about this particular place or just about foreign policy and the world in general, that you felt like you drew on when you were making this really, really, really difficult decision?
Yeah. I'm Jewish. My family's all Jewish. Grandparents are from Eastern Europe in various parts. And so the moral logic was really simple and really easy. And I think anybody who grows up Jewish is correctly beat over the head with, hey, everything that happened to us was really bad. pogroms, the Holocaust, the entire Jewish history uh, should never be repeated again. And, we have very little sympathy for people who are even tangentially associated in history to any of those events. And so looking at it from that perspective made it a lot harder to kind of intellectualize, like, well, I'm not, I'm working for a guy who provides this type of support to Israel. I'm not the one handing him the bombs. Because it's easy to do that, and a lot of people do that, and I did it too. But I think my background made it easier to be like, all right, in 10 years, how is this going to look? How are we going to think about the people who said they were supporting the Israeli Ministry of Defense during this period? Are we going to listen to their reasoning that no, actually, it was on this less directly related topic? So once that thought entered my head, like, it was a question of how I was going to do it, but I felt like I didn't really have that much of a choice
It's interesting that you phrase it that way, and it is reminiscent of the way some other Jewish Biden, appointees who have resigned have spoken. But as you know well, there's another kind of discourse that exists, among American Jews, among Jews in general,
Yeah.
which also draws on that history, but takes a very different lesson, which kind of ends up saying, it's a very dangerous world. Israel has enemies that want to destroy it. America and Jews need to support Israel, especially after the horrors of October 7th with a group like Hamas, etc. I'm curious why that storyline, which is actually in some ways the more dominant one from American Jewish kind of communal leadership, why that was less compelling to you than the kind of never again for anybody kind of universal.
Yeah. Well, again, it depends whether your takeaway from the Holocaust is that it was bad because it happened to Jews, or it was bad because it happened to people. And if your takeaway is that it was really just bad because it happened to Jews, so we have to make sure nothing happens to Jews ever again. Yeah, you're right. That is the dominant perspective that I hear, but it's not the one that you can hold if you believe everyone's a human being. And also a cursory understanding of Israel's history would tell you, even before, during, and after October 7th, there was not an existential threat to the state of Israel. I would argue there hasn't been one for a long time, if ever. And I'm not Israeli. I'm an American Jew, and I think there's maybe an obligation to keep me safe here in the States, but yeah. And let me add to that, is that if even for people who think it's a really important goal to keep Israelis safe, and again, I want to distinguish that from keeping Jews safe, because you're Jewish, right? We are Jews, not in Israel, and I don't really think what happens to Israel has any bearing on my safety, except now in the sense that because of Israel's behavior, there's a whole range of crimes now that are associated with Jews in general, which is unfortunate. But anyway, the Netanyahu government's policy and our policy in support of it has made Israelis demonstrably less safe by every measure. And October 7th was tragic, and every single thing that our government and their government has done since has made life harder and worse and more dangerous for Israelis, to say nothing of the Palestinians and other people in the region.
So you talked a little earlier about the kind of internal discourse in the Department of Defense, and then the people that you were interacting with. And I wonder if you can just elaborate on that. You said something interesting. You said that you felt like higher level officials were sounded kind of dejected or fatalistic when they were discussing. So it doesn't, and those aren't the kinds of words that one generally uses to describe like high level Pentagon, U.S. military officials, right? So help me understand, was it that just they felt that Biden was going to do whatever he was going to do regardless of what, or that the politics was such? Like, what was leading them to it sounds like you're suggesting they actually didn't think this was such a great idea, but they just felt disempowered about doing anything about it.
Yeah, and I think there are definitely folks, including at quite high levels, who feel that way. I don't want to make you think it's everybody. There's definitely people who, I mean, everybody informed on this topic in the intel community or in DoD has a pretty good understanding both of the human cost in Gaza and the risks of regional escalation and risks to our relationships with our Arab partners in the region. There's still definitely folks, high up folks, who understand all that and think, yeah, those are unfortunate risks, but it's well worth it to support Israel. And there's certainly a lot of people, I think, who understanding all those terrible risks don't think it's the wisest policy. And even, in the early days after the war, it wasn't so much, oh, this is a Biden thing, because kind of everybody understood, right? 2 weeks after October 7th, we're going to do a full court press in support of Israel. It was a little bit like, I mean, we saw this last week, right? They blew up Hania in Tehran and didn't tell us, right? That was not unusual behavior of them doing something dramatic and surprising us with it, and then we had to react. Mm-hmm. That was happening in October, and so everybody, again, I'd say in our institutions, even people who really like Israel, generally, outside of October 7th, don't always find their Israeli counterparts the most easy to work with partners. And again, in a way that was demonstrated quite publicly last week. And so you have, people feeling like that they are in react mode, which nobody in the military likes to be. And at, reacting to the whims of this other state.
What was your in the intelligence world? What was the assessment of that you and your colleagues were making early on about whether Israel would be able to destroy Hamas, since that was the stated goal of the war in Gaza, that Israel would destroy Hamas?
Nothing that the IDF is complaining about today would have been a surprise in the winter of 2023.
So when you say complaining about, what are you talking about in particular?
Yeah, so right, there's I think several senior Israeli officers have publicly, most famously, I think the IDF spokesman publicly gone out to say the goal of destroying Hamas is impossible. Which, even if they hadn't announced it, I think that the facts on the ground would also lead us to that same conclusion. And yeah, nothing about that is a surprise to anybody, I think, including the Israelis, but certainly, it was not a surprise that Hamas had hundreds of miles of tunnels, right? And the IDF generally didn't want to go inside those tunnels. And the ground campaign was kind of a mess anyway, and there's a limit to how much you can bomb people who are underground if you don't know where they are. So that was all well understood on October 8th. And I don't think anybody, again, the only surprise I think that I had and that others had is that the Israelis did not let up sooner. And there was some hope for that, I think, in the first months. But the fact that Hamas is still well capable of defending its territory and lobbing things to Israel is not surprising.
One of the analogies that you hear from Israeli officials sometimes is an analogy between their war in Gaza and the U.S. war against ISIS. They'll say, the U.S. had to, U.S. dropped tons and tons of bombs, killed lots of civilians, but it was necessary and it was successful. Where do you think, I imagine you think that analogy is not a particularly good one, and I'm curious where you think it breaks down.
So I guess they use that right, because then there's some parts of the defeat ISIS campaign, maybe Mosul. I'm trying to think some others where our air campaign killed a lot of civilians. I mean, first of all, I'd say that doesn't mean it's good to do it again.
Right.
Let me start.
Right.
Let me start there.
Yeah.
Right. You could list a whole laundry list of unfortunate things that the U.S. military has done.
Right.
I would not say that any of those obligates us to help the Israelis do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I could start there.
Right.
Um, you know, it doesn't mean it's in our interest to help the Israelis repeat our best mistakes or our bloodiest campaigns. Um, you know, we I'm not saying our best was good enough,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but CENTCOM made an attempt, or at least thought. Listen, we were not deliberately starving Mosul. We were not deliberately starving people. We went for a military objective that we knew was going to kill a lot of civilians.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not defending that judgment,
Mm-hmm.
but I think at no point did we think our policy was going to result in ethnic cleansing, and at no point were some members of our government trying to make it achieve that end. So, and I mean, the most important part beyond all of it is, you know, okay, you have this campaign that's killing a lot of civilians. What is your theory of victory? What is your realistic and achievable end state that you're aiming toward? Defeat ISIS campaign had one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worthy to debate whether the ends justified the means there. But the Israelis, and this is again something we knew in November and hasn't changed,
Mm-hmm.
have no theory of victory, have no plan. There is no idea that okay, well we have to blow up this entire neighborhood. That will lead to this next step, to this next phase, and that will win the war for us. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no mission accomplished moment, even that they have in their head.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another reason that it's different.
Yeah. You used the word ethnic cleansing, and I'm curious, just from the vantage point you had of inside the intelligence agencies, there was reporting early on that there were people inside the Israeli government who were interested in trying to force a lot of Palestinians from Gaza into Egypt, and there were various reports about the U.S. Perhaps trying to prevent that from happening, or what approach the U.S. was having. Because you mentioned that term ethnic cleansing, I'm curious what you were seeing on that front while you were still in government.
I think Egypt is probably the main reason that there's not more Palestinians in Egypt.
Not the
Uh,
Biden administration.
I think it's not accurate to say that there are the Biden's many conversations with Netanyahu had no effect, and this is in general, right? Not just about this issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say that they had a meaningful effect. So I would suspect that communicating the misgivings of Egypt is probably the most important thing that they did, if anything, and this is speculative. If I'm sure if and this would never have happened if Sisi had been amenable to accepting a bunch of Palestinians, we would have facilitated that.
Right, right. I'm curious about what the conversation was and is, to the degree that you're still familiar with it, about the degree to which this war increases the risks of attacks on Americans.
Yes, and again, that was something that was understood very early on. Uh, there's all kinds of offices and multiple agencies that both do counterterror and measure public sentiment. And I think you've seen there was a report a month or so ago, maybe out of state, that was saying what we all kind of knew, which is yes, everybody in the region really hates America more than they have in a long time, because it's not hard for them to associate the U.S. government with Gaza. And again, it was like I said, every single consequence not only was predictable but has been predicted. Somebody, if you thought about it, somebody wrote a report saying, or an assessment saying, "Wow, it looks like this might happen." Looks like we're going to see a generation of terror attacks or attempts driven by this one event, or a surge in recruitment because of this event, or all of the other fallout that we're seeing. So it's, those consequences were not judged significant enough by the administration. That's why we're here. But they were all very well understood from the start.
Right. One thing that, I mean, in some ways it's ironic to be bringing her up, but, before Samantha Power was in government, she was famous for writing this book about genocide and about the way the United States had responded in genocides. And she kind of makes the point in that book, A Problem from Hell, that it's very difficult inside the government to speak in openly moral terms. It kind of makes you look like
Yeah.
a softy, you're supposed to talk about hard power, strategic, blah, blah, blah. And obviously you're responding, and you talked about at the beginning, fundamentally from a moral perspective, right? And I'm just curious, were you able, maybe not only, but that was clearly a very powerful drive. Were you able to articulate that inside the government? And what would happen if you just said to people like, listen, we should not be giving the bombs that are killing kids, period. Like, is it possible to speak that way inside the DIA and in the Department?
I mean, it's definitely not our culture, right? This is not State Department where people are much more comfortable expressing their grievances. We don't do that in general. We certainly don't do it around policies that are understood to be politicized. But I did talk openly about it at the end. It was kind of, I was already on my way out.
Mm-hmm.
I thought people, I owed it to some of the people I cared about in the office to hear it from me firsthand. And, and my resignation letter, I sent it to my office internally before I ever shared it publicly. And that was very unusual. People don't do that normally. And a lot of people agreed with me, but it didn't change anything. Senior people I talked to about this were very sympathetic and wished that the policy would be different and kept doing their job. So, and I know friends elsewhere who've expressed their concerns, and their boss said, yep, this sucks. And that's the end of it.
Well, help me understand that a little bit more, because you said something earlier that made a lot of sense to me, which is you didn't want to have to be looking in the mirror 10 years from now and accounting for yourself, right? So if you can think that way, presumably other people can think that way, right? And what is it that makes someone who believes that the policy they're implementing is wrong, maybe fundamentally immoral, continue to do so and think that that's a wise decision that they're gonna be happy about down the road?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I've had a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues about just that. I think we can really put it into two categories. One of them is quite simple, which is that people have to pay rent. And it may surprise you to hear that people inside the Intel community are also operating out of that framework. But I worked with a lot of very smart people who all had graduate degrees. A lot of them had student debt. They live in DC, or they've got a kid and they don't have another way to get them healthcare, and it's very sad. But there's a lot of people who are just like, I need a job.
Right.
I guess slightly more sympathetic to those, and then there's a lot of folks who, especially some of the more senior ones, but not exclusively them, who just find a way to self-justify. And I think people, and right, if you've been in the military or DoD or Intel world for 15 years, 20 years, beyond, you're smart, you have been part of policies that you did not think were great in the past, right? Everybody leading us is somebody who did their whole career in the global war on terror, which, especially if you're in the Intel world, right? It's not like those people didn't know Iraq and Afghanistan were a disaster, and it was just something that you trudged through, knowing that it wasn't really a great idea. But I think very specifically, there's people who tell themselves, if I quit or transfer, somebody worse will take my position. Which in this case, I've responded directly. I said, that can be true sometimes, but how would the policy be any worse if you left and the number one Palestinian hater in the world came and took your job? Like, what would be going on differently? What would be making this worse? So that's one justification. And then the this is a direct quote, and I don't want to laugh, but the people who go, well, I'm not that senior now, but if I stay in, maybe in 10 years, I'll be important enough, I can step in for the next genocide. And there are people who self-justify that way as well. To whom I say, like, you may be the biggest star in, I don't know, State Department or CIA, wherever. You're probably not going to be the Secretary of State,
Mm-hmm.
and you're almost certainly not going to be the president. So you even if you are the biggest hero this agency's ever seen, you're probably still not going to be the person making the decision in the end, even in 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of what's happening now, I'm curious about you're not on the inside anymore, but you probably have some sense of how these decisions get made, and what is your sense about what the U.S. has been doing since the spate of Israeli assassinations to try to stave off a massive regional war, and how likely you think that is to succeed?
I can't, guarantee what the outcome will be of this particular, round of retaliations from Hezbollah and Iran. But, we've been doing the same thing that we've done since October, which is the maximum level of pressure we're willing to apply is stern words with Netanyahu. And that's the last thing that has come out of the Biden administration is, more leaks. I'm doing quotation marks here, saying what stern words the president had with Netanyahu. And that, so, and to be clear, that does reflect, I think, a genuine desire to not have Israel bomb Beirut and invade Lebanon and bomb Tehran. I think they do want that.
Yeah.
But the attempts to shape the outcome are limited within the bounds of, well, we can do anything but actually apply pressure to Israel. We'll do anything, and that's the same for Gaza, right? It would be better if they weren't doing this big massacre in Gaza, and we will do anything we can to head this off, short of using any of our leverage. And so,
is there any other country that the U.S. acts that way towards?
I think the short answer is no. The closest has been, maybe Saudi Arabia and Egypt at times, but those we've at least nominally, cut arms to or support to when they sufficiently displeased us.
You mean like the Saudi war in Yemen or something like that?
Yeah. And actually, I'm glad you asked that for the Saudi war in Yemen. For context, I also worked on Ukraine, as you mentioned. Even Ukraine, which I think after Israel was, at least this is changing. Maybe it was like the most beloved junior partner that the U.S. found itself with. Constantly, they were making hard decisions and telling them no, and withholding this arms system or putting limitations on military support with the express purpose of avoiding unnecessary escalation with Russia. And so they know how to do it. And they've done it fairly successfully in another theater. We don't want to do it with Israel.
Right. And how likely do you think it is that the U.S. could get dragged into such a war?
I unfortunately, I think it's very likely. And I'm not creative enough to think of another outcome of what happens if Netanyahu invades Lebanon in an attempt to defeat Hezbollah, which is something that they're not capable of doing. It goes really badly. They're getting trounced in southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah is shooting rockets, missiles that are hitting all over Israel. And at that point, Netanyahu's publicly demanding U.S. airstrikes or intensified support from Biden. And it's
on
really
Lebanon
tough
or against Iran?
Well, I would say Lebanon would be an easier ask. I see Iran coming soon, right? I mean, Netanyahu has wanted us to fight a war against Iran on his behalf for a decade plus, right? So it's easier for me to imagine Joe, or whoever's telling Joe Biden at this point, for him to hold off on Iran. Lebanon, while Hezbollah is bombarding Israel every day, right before the election, it's tough to imagine Biden saying no, for me. I mean, given that he hasn't said no on anything, and we would be at a point where Israel is like actually suffering.
Right, right. So then the U.S. would literally, U.S. warplanes and missiles will be bombing Beirut or southern Lebanon.
Maybe. And again, it seems like a terrible idea, but we have missiles hitting Tel Aviv every day. Is Biden going to tell him no?
Right,
And
right,
he hasn't said no once. And it's like it sounds so dangerous to even to consider this possibility, but it's just looking at how it would be a massive break, both sort of strategically and emotionally and personally, if
right,
Biden told him no in that moment.
right, right. I'm curious whether there have been any, I imagine you've had many, many people reach out to you since you resigned, from all different walks of life. And I'm just curious if there are any particular responses to your resignation that you've gotten that were particularly significant or meaningful to you.
Yeah, I mean, the most meaningful was hearing people from my office write back to me or call me and tell me that they were grateful that I spoke out and that they felt the same way and that they felt like they couldn't talk about it. And that, since I left, they're still doing their work, but they've at least are openly discussing this topic now. And that, and then some people who I didn't know who reached out, who are also in the defense world and wanted to figure out something that they could do. And so I've worked with some of those people to find some means to work against, or at least speak out against our policy.
Well, Harrison, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. I can't help but think about a line in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, which says, "In the place where there is no man, be a man," which is a little bit gendered for 2024, but you get the idea. It's the idea is that when other people aren't stepping up in really important times, that becomes the most important time to do it. And it seems to me that really applies to you.
Well, thank you so much. Kind words. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch video versions of our podcast, including this one on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.